Here's what it has to do with Russian collusion. There was no Russian-Trump collusion. Mueller knows that now. He's spent all this time trying to find something, and he's found nothing. So his investigation, so-called, is going far afield with the support of Rosenstein. And this is a big problem for the establishment because they were so intent on proving that Trump worked with Putin or Putin worked with Trump and that Trump was Putin's puppet, and none of that has come out. So on the first level, it's a failure, almost an admission of a failure of Mueller to find anything on Trump. Now, this whole attack on Cohen becomes very interesting because I think in doing this, it shows the desperation. He's gone too far. This is an attack on attorney-client privilege. This goes against the backing principles of our legal system. And what Mueller was trying to do was to isolate Trump, create a situation where no lawyers would work with him, that Trump doesn't have a legal backing. And by doing this, he's actually rallied a whole section of the legal profession behind the president. So it's another example of a backfire. And on what? What's the issue here? That Trump may have had an affair with this porno actress, that his attorney may have given her some hush money. What's the legal basis for this when the argument is that you're trying to protect the country from a Russian takeover? So it shows the level of desperation. And I think there's another interesting aspect to this. Comey's book was released, at least in part today, through the Washington Post and elsewhere. And what comes through in the subtext is what we and others said at the time, that Comey was trying to blackmail Trump in the very beginning. His first meeting with Trump, where he went in and showed him the Steele dossier and told him what they had, Comey once described that as a J. Edgar Hoover moment. Now, what did he mean? This is what Hoover and the FBI did famously in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They would blackmail people based on sexual peccadillos that were picked up through wiretapping and so on. They blackmailed people. Comey went into Trump and basically said, look, we've got this dossier and we're going to use this to bring you down if you don't play our game. And Trump had the guts to do what most presidents didn't do, which is to say, but there's nothing illegal that I did. There's no basis for it. And I want you to tell the people that. And what does Comey say? Comey says that was obstruction of justice. So we're seeing now, in the attempt to put Comey in a good light and Trump in a bad light, it actually shows exactly what the Mueller raid of or the Mueller ordered raid of Cohen's office shows, which is that they're desperate. They're violating all aspects of American legal practice to try to get rid of Trump or to try and control Trump. So I think it just shows the desperation on behalf of the people running the whole Russiagate operation.
Rod Rosenstein, he actually signed off on this. Is he implicated in this whole thing too?
Well, I just saw a news flash about a half hour ago with Rosenstein telling his friends that he's expecting to be fired. Maybe he's doing this to get fired. I don't know. Maybe he's had enough. But he did sign off on it. And he's a smart enough lawyer to know that this is beyond the beyond. So, maybe there's something else going on here. But I think the fact that Trump has refused to buckle, that some people in the Congress turned this around and started going after the FBI, after elements of the Justice Department, making the Steele dossier the issue, the FISA court the issue. This has been almost a rout of the coup plotters. And I think what would finish it off is if Trump were to come out and just lay out, here's what they did, here's my response, now we've got to clean this up. And whether he fires Rosenstein or Mueller or let them just shrink into the sunset, I think the Russiagate issue itself has played itself out.
Yeah, I don't think they can take it any further. I think it's just dead in the water. And this is why you hear nothing from the corporate media anymore. They just, kind of just don't mention it anymore. And this is why Mueller, looks like to me he's floundering and he's just trying to do anything right now. And it looks like the deep state, they're throwing everything into this because, out in the UK, we had the Skripal poisoning. And, that whole thing was, to me, it looked like they were trying to start something up with Russia once again.
Let me just go back to the Mueller thing again. I think what may also be at play here is that since they have nothing legally that they can do, they're going after a psychological profile of Trump to try and, in a sense, blackmail him or break him down over the question of hitting his family and especially his wife. These salacious stories going back to the original Steele report, Stormy Daniels, and so on. This is pretty vicious stuff. And the story that came out today that his doorman at the Trump Hotel claimed that he fathered a child with a housemaid. That sounds like a repeat of the actual story of Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, I think they're operating on a psychological profile. Can they use this, including going after his friend and lawyer for more than 20 years, to cause a psychological breakdown in conjunction with these other false flags? And, I'm hoping that the president will continue to show the willingness to stand up and fight this. But it's dirty. It's really dirty. And it shows you how corrupt this deep state really is. Words really don't do justice to how filthy these operations are.
No, they have to really invoke emotion, and it looks like that's what they're trying to do, because everything they're coming out with, there's no evidence or basis or anything. There's nothing of substance, and they're just playing on people's emotion, trying to get everyone all riled up, and yeah, you're right, we should investigate. Meanwhile, the investigation should really be on Clinton, McCain, and the rest of the people. But
and they're also trying to drive a wedge between Trump and his supporters by saying, look, Trump is immoral, he has all these affairs, he lies. And, if Trump stays true to the issues he ran on, people don't care if he had an affair in 2005 or 2006. It may mean something for his wife, but, his supporters are looking to see, is he going to fight these guys? And if he stands up and fights, this isn't going to hurt him politically.
So while all that is going on with Trump, we see this poisoning out in the UK, where it looks like the deep state is trying to get something started with Russia by pushing that Russia actually poisoned Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal. And they're saying it was the Novichok nerve agent, and they have been pushing this. And of course, once again, there's really no evidence. They haven't really presented any evidence, but they're just out there just telling everyone, yes, it was Russia, Russia, Russia. Why did they do this? What was their motivation, and what were they trying to push with all this?
You have to understand, and as you do, and I know a lot of your listeners do, what was the initial motive for going after Trump? It really had nothing to do with fixing an election. For some people, it had to do with just anguish over Hillary losing. And for others, it was a big bet. They had bet the farm on Hillary winning and continuing the same policies. And Trump coming in blew that apart. From the beginning, Russiagate was about preventing Trump from overturning the policies of the continuity of the Bush and Obama policies, which included regime change wars, which included phony war on terrorism and the establishment of a deeper and deeper surveillance state, which included provocations against Russia and China. The ultimate goal was regime change in Russia. And going after Trump as they did, people shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this was around specifically the fact that Trump said he wants to work with Putin, in particular against terrorism. Now, that's where the chemical weapons issue and the false flag in Skripal and then the false flag in East Ghouta come into play. What are they trying to say? They're trying to say the Russians are killers, the Syrians are killers, and Trump, you shouldn't work with these guys. And what's most fascinating about it is they're replaying the period before the second Iraq War. Remember the story came through MI6, the original dossier that was delivered by Sir Richard Dearlove to Tony Blair, which he delivered to Bush and Cheney, which said George Tenet said, a slam dunk that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And we find out that it was a complete fraud and total fraud. So what do we see again? Well, in the Russiagate, Christopher Steele, a protege of Sir Richard Dearlove, who was steered by Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the former head of MI6, to go to the FBI with his fake dossier. Then what do we see in the Skripal affair? Skripal was recruited when he was a Russian intelligence agent by the British by a man named Pablo Miller, who worked side by side with Christopher Steele at MI6. And in fact, Pablo Miller was until recently listed as a consultant working for Orbis, which is Steele's company, the company hired by Hillary Clinton to do the dossier against Trump. So it's the same small network. And of course, evidence. Who needs evidence when you have the media backing up every lie you tell? Who needs evidence when the U.S. intelligence community is side by side with the British intelligence community on each one of these lies? Because they have the same goal as British intelligence, which is to stop the Trump-Russia relationship. Now, on the Skripal affair, they had the same problem that Tony Blair had, which is that there are still a few honest people in the United Kingdom. And some of them work for Porton Down, the chemical weapons lab for the United Kingdom. And when they were tasked with the responsibility of lying to say that this was a Russian agent, a Russian chemical agent, it was probably done by the Russians, they came out and said, we can't confirm what the origin is of this chemical weapon. And it blew the thing apart completely, because you had Boris Johnson and Theresa May telling everyone it had to be Russia. We know it had to be Russia. Our experts tell us it was Russia. And then the experts come out and say, we can't confirm that. So then what happens? Another set of so-called experts, the White Helmets, the Syrian Observatory Group. And these sound like prominent, important non-governmental organizations when you hear them on the media. The White Helmets are almost fully subsidized by British intelligence. They're a branch of MI6, and there are only a few of them. And they're Syrian emigres who are living fairly well in the United Kingdom, backed by the British intelligence and money from the State Department. And they're the main source putting out the story, once again, that chlorine gas and other chemical weapons were used by Assad against his own people. Now, these things are nothing but lies. Now, the problem is if all you have is the Western media and Western politicians who are ready to jump to an anti-Putin conclusion on everything, then there's a little bit of confusion initially. But what I'm finding, Dave, from the radio work I do and the articles I'm writing, is the majority of Americans, and you see this in the polls, the majority of Americans don't buy most of this. Remember, Trump got elected partly by saying that the war in Syria is not worth a single drop of American blood or a single dollar of taxpayers' money. Now, when you talk about this continuity, this as one operation, first Skripal and then first Russiagate, then Skripal, then the chemical weapons false flag in Syria. What was the other thing Trump was doing during that time? He came out and said about 10 days ago, we're pulling out of Syria. We beat ISIS. He said this after his discussion with Putin in early March when he called to congratulate him. Or in mid-March, he said, we're pulling out of Syria. We've done our job. And so now you have this false flag chemical weapons to try and force the Americans to stay in Syria and fight this war and try to turn Trump into Hillary Clinton. Remember, this was Hillary's plan, a war against Russia. Now, we're seeing Trump backtracking. And I don't know what's going to happen. There may still be a strike of some sort, maybe for a symbolic reason, which would be stupid. But I don't think there's going to be all-out war because the Russians and the Americans are talking. And they're basically saying, look, you know this is bull. You know there was no chemical attack. Do you really want a nuclear war over this? And I think the most sane person in the room right now, at least in the cabinet, is General Mattis, the defense secretary, who acknowledged last year that the March 2017 alleged chemical weapons attack by the Assad regime, that we fired missiles at a Syrian airbase, that Mattis said, we never confirmed that it was a gas attack, and we never confirmed it was done by Assad. So I think the blowback on these things are potentially enormous, provided the president doesn't get stampeded by the British and the French into doing something stupid.
Now, we were discussing before we went on air that there is a possibility that there could be some other type of false flag to try to push Trump into doing something, either by the UK, Israel, the coalition forces, because France, because, they're pretty much stuck, because everyone is sitting here saying, even Nikki Haley in the United States and in the UN is saying that it's definitely Syria, it's definitely Assad, and we should attack. So as time goes on and investigators go into Syria and they start investigating and gathering evidence, well, all these individuals, what is going to happen when they come out with the report that says, yeah, what you're saying is not exactly true?
Well, the OPCW, the line at the UN from the French, the British, and the US, Nikki Haley, is that the Russians and Syrians won't let anyone in to investigate. And the Russians and Syrians said, come on in, we'll protect you. And there's a fairly large deployment of Russian officials in that area, both to protect the OPCW investigators, but also to make sure that there's not a bombing of that area which would obscure any so-called evidence. The classic case would be to blow up the area so no one can tell what was there. Now, the bigger danger, which you're alluding to, is that look at the players in this. You have Theresa May, who's doing all this because she's falling apart. She has an extremely narrow hold onto power right now. And part of it is that she's playing some dirty tricks on Brexit. She's working with some of the Tories and also probably with Tony Blair. And we'll get to Blair in a moment. But working with these networks to try and come up with either a second referendum or an argument that Russia was responsible for the pro-Brexit vote, and so you have to throw it out. Now, that's not going to work in the United Kingdom because Brexit is still popular there. So I think May is extremely weak. Then you look at Macron, the golden boy of the Rothschild, because that's really who he was before he came in. What's his problem? He's trying to destroy the unions by going with a total deregulated free trade policy in France, and working people are opposing him, and he's having real problems. So what does he do? He says, we're going to go in and we're going to teach Assad a lesson, even if the United States doesn't. And the rest of Europe is, you have on the one hand spineless characters like Angela Merkel, who's got a very thin hold on power, who's basically saying, well, Assad is bad, Putin is bad, but we're not going to participate. You have the likely Italian government, Salvini from the Northern League, said there should be no attack on Syria. Assad didn't do it. The Russians didn't poison Skripal, and we're going to vote against sanctions when it comes up again in the EU. So you're beginning to see a split in Europe. Orban in Hungary won a very significant vote against George Soros and the EU bureaucracy. So these are people who are very weak. One of the strongest leaders right now is Trump, in spite of all the attacks on him. So if Trump wanted to, he could turn the tables on everyone. And as you were saying, if there's an investigation which shows the truth, which is that, as the Russians are saying, it was probably the British who poisoned Skripal, that you have this potential for a blowback, which could bring down some of these institutions which are very weak right now. Now, the other argument, Dave, that you're hearing is that would play into Putin's hands because Putin's goal is to break apart Europe. That's not Putin's goal. Putin's goal from the beginning was to have Russia be integrated into European economic development. The problem he's had from the beginning is that the EU, the European Union, is a product of the City of London financial system, which only wants to loot. And the NATO forces are a product of Anglo-American defense contractors and neoconservatives who want to destroy Russia. So there was nothing for Putin to ally with. And so what they're trying to do is isolate Putin with the idea that maybe they can get a regime change in Russia. And of course, they were completely shocked when Putin got over 70% of the vote in the last election there. So I think the world is moving in a very interesting way. And if we can get through this next period without a serious confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, I think it will strengthen Trump. Trump has a diplomatic agenda now. He's meeting later this week, or next week rather, with Prime Minister Abe from Japan. He's in constant contact with the Chinese now on this whole question of the new Silk Road and trade negotiations and so on. He has a meeting coming up, undefined when yet, with both Putin and with Kim Jong-un. So there's a lot he's moving to do. And finally, the first thing John Bolton did, for those people who saw Bolton's emergence as a big problem, was to fire the woman who largely drafted under McMaster the U.S. Strategic Policy Review, which saw Russia and China as the leading enemies of the United States. Nadia Shadlow, I think was her name. So Bolton comes in and fires her. So there's a lot going on that doesn't make sense from the narrative of the mainstream media. What makes sense is that there's a desperate establishment clinging to power with an extremely weak economy, with a real danger of hemorrhaging from rising interest rates, losing the bond market, having a collapse of debt, and seeing a strengthening of a Russia-China-Eurasian perspective. And Trump interested in possibly joining with Russia and China rather than staying in this collapsing Titanic. So I think that defines things, and it becomes extremely interesting. And people have to think on that higher strategic level and not be so panicked by these day-to-day tidbits that come out.
Do you think Trump really knows what happened in Syria? I mean, because the U.S. has satellites all over the place. They have, intel on the ground on what's going on. We know that there's an open channel between the United States and Russia has been saying, for the last couple of weeks that the whole thing, the gas attacks, they're staged. They were planning on it.
Remember that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, 2 months ago said they have evidence that there would be a staged attack by the Soviet rebels.
So do you think that Trump really knows what's happening, but he just can't come out and say, oh, yes, I agree with Russia. Yes, it was staged, done by, the UK or Saudi Arabia, whoever did it. And he can't come out and say that because then people would say, oh, look, he's working with Russia on this whole thing. So do you really think he knows what's going on here?
Yeah, I don't know if he's that Machiavellian. I don't know. Personally, I don't know him. I know some people who know him who say that he's very bright, but he's also very erratic. But I think he knows in his gut what he wants to do. And in his gut, he believes, and this is what he said after the discussion with Putin, I think on March 20th, he said, we cannot afford a new arms race. And the danger of neocons saying we have to prepare for war. We need new generations of nuclear weapons. We need low-yield battlefield nuclear weapons. This is another boondoggle for defense contractors. It's also in line with what the neocons want. This is something that Trump doesn't want because he understands if you spend trillions in these useless wars, that's money that doesn't go into education, doesn't go into new plant and equipment, doesn't go into infrastructure. And so to the extent that he wants to do these things, he's got to figure out who's pulling the strings on these things. I think getting rid of McMaster was very important. I'm not sure. Getting rid of Tillerson, it turns out, in retrospect, was a good thing because Tillerson was being two-faced. He was saying one thing to Trump and another thing when he was overseas. I don't particularly have much hope for Pompeo, but what I'm told is that Trump is making his own decisions. So does he have the right gut instincts? That I don't know. Does he have a flow of intelligence that he needs? Well, if he's relying on the CIA, if he's relying on the State Department, he's getting a lot of crap. So does he have other channels? And I think he does. And I think there are back channels. I think there are people who are talking to him, including some of the ambassadors, including some of the people, for example, the people who are doing back channel work with North Korea. So I think he's getting a picture that's much more refined than what the media would have you believe, and that it's not just erratic reactions. But if you're asking me how much do I think he really knows about this, I think I was told he figured out that the March 2017 so-called gas attack was not an Assad chemical weapons attack, and that he was used by that. But who are the people pushing it? If it was true that it was Ivanka and Jared Kushner, he's not going to turn on them. So, he's not going to say I was wrong. But I do think there's reasons to be optimistic, even though it's an extremely dangerous situation. Now, the other danger, I mentioned Macron might bomb, the British might bomb. The other incalculable element in this is Israel. Netanyahu's a lunatic. The rabid right-wing Zionists in Israel are very closely allied with the Saudis and with British intelligence and the U.S. CIA. And they're spoiling for a war. Perhaps they'll trigger something. Maybe they'll hit a U.S. base in Syria and try and make it look like the Russians. There are a lot of things that could happen by accident that could trigger a nuclear war. But I think the fact that the Russian military and the U.S. military are talking, and that we've seen, as you pointed out, a bit of time pass for cooler heads to prevail, maybe this thing will work out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very tough to attack Syria because of the military assets that Russia has and that Syria purchased, like the S-400, the S-300. I mean, they've been placed all around the country now, and I'm sure they're reprogrammed to hit anything that even approaches now. And I don't even see anything getting in there to actually do anything. They have the electronic jamming, just like the first round when Trump fired the missiles. A lot of the missiles didn't even make it. They were brought down. So even if we tried to do something, I don't even think it would work. Now, the only way it could work is if there's coordination with Russia and Putin, where we're not really going after Russia. We're really not going after Assad. And we're not even firing the missiles at these locations. We're firing missiles at other targets. And most likely this could be Islamic State.
The problem is that any conception of a limited war is crazy. Haven't we seen that with the massive amounts of manpower and money we committed to Iraq, to the so-called war on terror? It wasn't until the Russians came in that we turned the situation around against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So, if you're even a conventional military theorist, you look at this situation and you say, what is the U.S. aim in a strike on Syria? Is it really going to punish Assad? Is it to hold up some principle of honor? How can you have honor when the previous U.S. president was supporting the terrorists? There are a lot of things the Russians could say if they wanted to about Obama and about the British role. In fact, the Russians are beginning to talk a little bit about the British. But even when you talk to people who are knowledgeable in Russia, or you look at what Lavrov is saying or Putin, they're basically saying they still want to work with the United States. It may be difficult given the present circumstance, but they still want to. And then you get, I think, things that are really quite hilarious. I don't know if you saw this. Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry, was asked about Trump's tweet about new, shiny, smart missiles. And Zakharova said, well, if those missiles are really smart, they'll hit the terrorists who did the gas attack. You need a little humor in these situations, because otherwise you just look at a certain level of insanity. These neoconservatives, just like the neoliberals on economics, they're insane. They've been doing the same thing now for 20 to 30 years, and all it has done is destroy nations, killed people, wrecked economies, stolen savings of people, shut down necessary industry and production. And what's their solution? More of the same. And that's what Albert Einstein said is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So there's a move worldwide to get rid of this gang, to replace them with an economic policy based on physical production, based on advances in science, based on educating a workforce and deploying them in infrastructure and other entry-level positions where they can learn new technologies. That's the way of the future. And this is something that Trump does see because he's had an interest in what the Chinese are doing. He has a very deep fascination with Xi Jinping in China. And I think that's a positive. And instead, what the media says is China is trying to replace the United States as the world power. Why isn't Trump standing up to them the way Obama did in the South China Sea?
So the corporate media is out there, and Trump mentioned something about the TPP. Now, when he first came into office, he basically struck it down and said, no, we're not having the TPP.
One of his first acts.
Yeah. Lately, just a day ago or today, he said, we're going to look into the TPP and maybe we can rewrite it, change things, and use it. Why do you think he's taking this approach to looking at the TPP if he already, struck it down?
The original TPP was a disaster, and that's what Trump opposed. And he's not going to sign the U.S. on to going into the same old TPP that Hillary Clinton called the gold standard of free trade agreements. So that's not going to happen. Now, what is interesting is there's an ongoing discussion now between the United States and China over what is a real problem. Look, any way you cut it, we have, I think, $375 billion trade deficit with China last year. The Chinese have restricted their markets in certain areas, and these are legitimate beefs that the president is raising. The Chinese know it. So Xi Jinping said, look, let's figure out a way to work this out. And so on the one hand, you have the usual tough rhetoric. The president seems to often start like it's a negotiation with mafia trade unions in the construction business in New York. You hit them over the head with a sledgehammer first to get their attention, then you negotiate. I think that's what's going on now with the TPP. The Chinese have a different view of free trade than the neoliberals in the transatlantic. Their view is that there should be competition, but there also should be openness toward multilateral agreements. And if the president has the attention of Xi Jinping, and they are talking, one of the things the Chinese are saying is, look, you want to deal with the trade deficit? We should figure out how you can sell more goods in China. Maybe that's part of what Trump is looking at with the revising, I should say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Also, there are Chinese who are saying they would like to invest in American infrastructure, using American workers to build it, funded by Chinese financial institutions. So there are a number of things in the negotiations which would mean that this would not be Hillary Clinton's Trans-Pacific Partnership or Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, but something more along the lines of a fair trade multilateral agreement that would benefit all parties. Now, if that's what he's talking about, that's certainly a valid alternative to these free trade agreements, which have bloated corporate bonuses while destroying American industry, American jobs, and American communities. So I think we'll have to hear more from him on it. But my suspicion is that there's something much deeper going on in the Trump-Xi Jinping relationship. And I think this is a good thing for pursuit. But I don't think anybody should worry that he's going to go to the original Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's been very clear on that.
So you mentioned that the economy is still not doing well. Have you seen any improvement in the economy, or are we still on the same exact track of the economy completely breaking down? We have too much debt and nothing's really been solved at this point.
Well, some of the signs that you have to look at are things like what the raising interest rates is going to do to bond markets, to corporate debt markets, to the so-called zombie banks and zombie corporations. What happens when the spread between LIBOR and the Fed rate becomes too great? These are the same things that happened in 2006 and 2007 that blew things out in 2008. In particular, the financial debt, the corporate debt, and now we're seeing more in private sector debt. The credit card delinquency rate is starting to jump. And when you start raising interest rates, when the Fed starts raising interest rates, when people are delinquent in their credit cards, instead of 19.9%, they're going to start being charged 34.9%, which means you're going to have a lot of defaults. Same thing is happening with the auto sector, where the old 36-month, 24 or 36-month car loan is now a 72-month, practically a lifetime car loan, and people can't afford them. The housing markets are completely skewed toward, on the one hand, these absurdly expensive valuations in areas like Silicon Valley, New York City, Miami, Tucson, Phoenix, that can't be sustained. And at the same time, the rental costs have gone way up. We're seeing commercial real estate, the large malls, the shopping malls, and companies like Sears and Macy's. All of these things are hitting. And meanwhile, what's happening with productivity? It's stagnant or dropping. So the fact that a few jobs were created in steel because of the tariffs, I think the steel tariffs were probably a useful step by Trump. But unless you come up with an overall credit policy and a banking policy which ends the too big to fail policy, in other words, the biggest banks can get liquidity knowing they'll be bailed out if they fail. But who gets bailed out? The banks, not the people whose money are in the banks. So I think unless we go with a Glass-Steagall policy, a national credit policy that makes credit to manufacturers and small and medium enterprises dependent on their investing in job production, expanding plant and equipment, those kinds of things which add value to the production process, unless that happens, we're heading towards something that will be bigger than 2008.
Do you think that the central banks, as they're raising rates, I mean, they're not stopping. They're saying they're going to raise them, a couple more times this year. I mean, it reminds me of, 2006, 2007, when the rates were going up and people were walking out of their California homes and things like that because they had the adjustable rate mortgages. It looks like they're doing the same exact plan.
You have people who haven't learned from their mistakes and they're doubling down. And the reason they can do it is because when the thing blew out in 2008, Bush and then Obama protected the swindlers, and the people who paid were the taxpayers and the middle class and working people. And as a result, people voted for Trump. Trump has to do something to deliver to those voters. And I think that's why we're going to see him making some fairly bold moves on trade and hopefully get back to the Glass-Steagall, which he says he supports, and also reevaluate what we're doing with credit policy.
Will that come in time, or will that even have any type of an effect of stopping the economy from breaking apart and imploding on itself?
If you were to go with the Glass-Steagall and basically say that if you're an investment bank, you're going to have to eat your losses. There's not going to be any bailout. If you're a commercial bank, we'll help you through this crisis with credit, provided you make sure that that credit is going into something physical, something productive. These things can help. What we need is to take the air out of the bubble. This is what the Chinese did. The Chinese realized they were going into a consumer credit bubble, and they took some fairly drastic measures, including jailing some bankers, and I think they executed some of the bankers who were the real swindlers in China. So we say that's barbaric. Well, what did we do? We let the bankers steal people blind, driving up suicide rates, the hopelessness in the population, the opioid epidemic, and these are all things that are derivative from the financial crisis. And we never address the real crooks and criminals. So I think if you do make an effort and do it across the board, And maybe do it in conjunction with the European Union, which needs to change also. Do it in conjunction with China, with the New Silk Road policy. These kinds of things can put something productive back under the currencies. Otherwise, what you've got is just funny money bloating banks and increasing the levels of unsustainable debt.
So do you think that this is a possibility where the economy can continue on, or do you think the central banks, as they continually raise rates, it looks like they're doing it on purpose, raising the rates, and it looks like they're following in the footsteps that they did back in 2006, 7, leading up to 2008. It looks like to me, and when I look at all this stuff, it's a race to bring down the economy before Trump can do anything.
Well, it is. And if you're a criminal speculator who got away with it in 2008, you have to ask yourself, why not keep doing it? It pays well, and there's no consequences. So if we don't make consequences, they will do it, and it will eventually bring down the economy. And this time, it may be much worse, much more catastrophic, because there's no room to create new bailouts.
Would it be better if the economy came down and Trump said, okay, listen, the economy's destroyed. We're getting rid of this banker type of economy, central bank type of economy, and we need to rework the whole thing. Let's get rid of, the central bank and all that, and let's restart the entire system.
We should do it, but it should be done in an orderly bankruptcy, because if not, you're leaving too much power in the hands of the criminals. What we need is a mobilization of thinking people. And, what I've laid out on Trump, it's not so much that I have faith and confidence in Trump. I have a certain respect for his willingness to stand up and fight this Russiagate as a measure of his willingness to stand up against the establishment. But he really needs the support of the American people, and he should do more to encourage that. But I would encourage your listeners to call the Congress and say, look, no wars, no more bankers' wars, no more bailouts of the Federal Reserve System. We've got to get back to physical production in this country. And LaRouche's basic four laws is the way to do it. And if people want more information on that, they can go to LaRouchePAC.com, email, or they can send me an email. As I've been doing recently, I've been sending out articles to many of your listeners